The summer of 1941 brought fire and ruin to the Soviet Union on a scale few could have imagined. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion launched on June 22nd, tore through Soviet defenses with devastating efficiency. In the opening weeks of the war, entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers found themselves trapped behind rapidly advancing German lines, facing a choice between death in combat or surrender into a captivity that would prove almost equally lethal. Among those caught in this catastrophic maelstrom was a young Soviet officer named Alexander Ivanovich Bondovsky, a man whose name would become synonymous with defiance, survival, and an almost superhuman refusal to accept. His early life followed a trajectory common to ambitious young men in the newly formed Soviet Union. He joined the Red Army in the early 1930s, a time when Stalin's military was expanding rapidly, and opportunities for advancement existed for those willing to dedicate themselves entirely to the service. Bondovsky proved himself capable and committed, rising through the ranks during the peacetime years when the Soviet military was undergoing both expansion and the devastating purges that would gut its officer corps. By the time Germany invaded in 1941, Bondovsky held the rank of major and commanded an artillery unit, a position that placed him directly in the path of the Wehrmacht's assault. The initial German offensive was catastrophic for Soviet forces. The Red Army, despite its numerical superiority on paper, was poorly positioned, inadequately supplied, and hamstrung by Stalin's refusal to believe intelligence reports warning of the impending attack. Within days of the invasion, German mechanized units had penetrated deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies in massive pockets. The Bialystok-Minsk encirclement alone trapped over 300,000 Soviet soldiers. The Kiev encirclement in September 1941 would claim over 600,000 prisoners. These were not orderly surrenders, but chaotic collapses, with Soviet units fragmented, communications severed, and command structures disintegrating under the relentless German advance. Bondovsky's unit was caught in one of these massive encirclements in the summer of 1941. The exact circumstances of his capture remain somewhat unclear in the historical record, as was common for many Soviet officers who fell into German hands during those chaotic months. What is documented is that by late summer 1941, Major Alexander Bondovsky was a prisoner of war, beginning what would become one of the most remarkable survival stories of the entire Eastern Front. The fate awaiting Soviet prisoners in German captivity was unspeakably grim. Nazi racial ideology viewed Slavs as subhuman, and Soviet prisoners of war were treated with a brutality that shocked even some Wehrmacht officers. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the war, roughly 3.3 million died in captivity. They died of starvation, exposure, disease, and deliberate murder. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, Soviet prisoners were kept in open-air camps with virtually no shelter, no medical care, and starvation rations. The death rates in some camps exceeded 50%. German policy explicitly called for the elimination of Soviet commissars and Communist Party members, and Jewish soldiers were separated out for immediate execution. Even ordinary Red Army soldiers were viewed as expendable labor to be worked to death. For Soviet officers, the situation carried additional dangers. Officers were often subjected to interrogation, and those identified as politically reliable members of the Communist Party faced execution. Stalin's infamous Order No. 270, issued in August 1941, declared that any Soviet soldier who surrendered was a traitor to the motherland. This order placed Soviet prisoners of war in an impossible position. If they somehow survived German captivity and returned home, they faced arrest, interrogation, and likely imprisonment in the Gulag system. Families of prisoners were denied state support and faced social stigma. The Soviet state viewed capture not as a misfortune of war, but as a criminal act of cowardice or collaboration. Bondovsky understood these realities with brutal clarity. He knew that survival in German captivity required not just physical endurance, but constant vigilance and an unwavering determination to escape. The historical record indicates that Bondovsky began planning his first escape almost immediately upon capture. This was not unusual among Soviet prisoners. Despite the horrific conditions and the risks involved, thousands of Soviet prisoners of war attempted escapes, driven by desperation, ideological commitment, or simple refusal to accept their fate. The success rate was low. Escapees faced hostile local populations in occupied territories, German security forces, collaborationist police units, language barriers, and the sheer geographical challenge of reaching Soviet lines hundreds of kilometers away. Bondovsky's first escape attempt came in the autumn of 1941. The exact date and location are not precisely documented in available sources, but the context of that period provides insight into what he faced. By autumn, the German advance had pushed deep into Soviet territory, reaching the outskirts of Moscow by October. Prisoner of war camps were scattered across occupied territories in Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia. These camps were often hastily established facilities with inadequate security, particularly in the early months of the war when the Germans were focused on the continuing offensive and had not yet systematized their prisoner of war administration. Bondovsky managed to escape from one of these camps, slipping away under circumstances that likely involved a combination of careful planning, exploitation of security gaps, and considerable physical courage. Once outside the camp perimeter, he faced the daunting task of navigating occupied territory and reaching Soviet lines. The occupied zones were dangerous for escaped prisoners. German security forces conducted regular sweeps. Local populations, particularly in western Ukraine and the Baltic states, were sometimes hostile to Soviet soldiers. Collaborationist police units actively hunted for escapees. Food was scarce, and the onset of the Russian winter made survival in the open a deadly challenge. Despite these obstacles, Bondovsky succeeded in evading capture for a period of weeks, possibly months. He likely relied on assistance from Soviet partisans, who by late 1941 were beginning to organize in the forests and swamps of occupied Belarus and northwestern Russia. The partisan movement, initially disorganized and poorly supplied, would eventually become a significant force behind German lines. But in late 1941, it was still in its infancy. Bondovsky may also have received help from sympathetic civilians, despite the enormous risks they faced. The Germans imposed collective punishment on villages suspected of aiding partisans or escapees, including executions and the burning of entire settlements. Bondovsky's first taste of freedom proved temporary. He was recaptured by German forces, the circumstances again not fully detailed in available records, but likely involving either betrayal, bad luck, or simply the overwhelming German security presence in occupied territories. Recaptured escapees faced severe punishment. German policy called for harsh treatment of those who attempted escape, including solitary confinement, reduced rations, transfer to punishment camps, or execution. That Bondovsky survived this recapture suggests either that his status as an officer provided some minimal protection, that he concealed his identity and previous escape attempt, or that in the chaos of the expanding war, his recapture was processed routinely without recognition of his earlier flight. What is remarkable is that Bondovsky's recapture did not break his will. Many prisoners ground down by starvation, disease, and the psychological trauma of captivity, lost the capacity to resist. Bondovsky instead began planning his second escape. This determination speaks to an extraordinary strength of character, a refusal to accept the seemingly inevitable fate that awaited Soviet prisoners in German hands. It also reflects the ideological conditioning of Soviet officers, many of whom had been trained to view surrender as unacceptable and resistance as a sacred duty. The second escape came sometime in 1942, a year that saw the war on the Eastern Front reach a brutal stalemate. The German offensive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad was underway, stretching Wehrmacht supply lines and diverting resources from rear-area security. The partisan movement had grown significantly, with Soviet authorities parachuting in trained cadres and establishing radio communications with partisan units. The occupied territories were becoming increasingly dangerous for German forces, with attacks on supply convoys, rail lines, and isolated garrisons occurring with growing frequency. Bondovsky's second escape was again successful in the initial phase. He broke out of captivity and once more found himself navigating the deadly landscape of occupied Soviet territory. This time, however, he benefited from a more developed partisan infrastructure. By 1942, partisan units were operating throughout Belarus and in parts of Ukraine and northwestern Russia, controlling significant areas of forest and swampland. These partisan zones provided refuge for escaped prisoners of war, and many escapees joined partisan units, bringing military training and combat experience to the resistance movement. The historical record suggests that Bondovsky made contact with partisan forces during his second escape. The partisans, despite their own desperate shortage of supplies and constant pressure from German anti-partisan operations, maintained networks for smuggling escaped prisoners back to Soviet lines. These routes were dangerous, often requiring weeks of movement through hostile territory, river crossings, and passage through German-controlled areas. The success rate was far from certain, but it offered the only realistic hope of reaching safety. Bondovsky's journey back to Soviet lines was almost certainly arduous and life-threatening. He would have traveled primarily at night, avoiding roads and settlements, relying on partisan guides who knew the terrain. He would have faced the constant threat of German patrols, collaborationist police, and informers. Food would have been scarce, obtained through partisan supply networks, or scavenged from the forest. The physical demands alone, particularly for someone weakened by months of captivity and inadequate nutrition, would have been immense. But Alexander Bondovsky succeeded. He reached Soviet-controlled territory, crossing the front lines and presenting himself to Soviet military authorities. This moment, which should have been one of triumph and relief, instead marked the beginning of a new ordeal. The Soviet state's treatment of returned prisoners of war was notoriously harsh, driven by Stalin's paranoia and the official ideology that viewed capture as treason. Every returned prisoner, regardless of circumstances, faced interrogation by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. The interrogations were designed to uncover collaboration with the enemy, to identify those who had agreed to serve as German agents, and to assess the political reliability of the returnee. For officers like Bondovsky, the scrutiny was particularly intense. The NKVD assumed that German intelligence would attempt to turn captured Soviet officers using threats, torture, or promises of better treatment to secure their cooperation. Some Soviet officers did collaborate, either out of ideological disillusionment with the Soviet system, desperation to survive, or coercion. The Germans established several anti-Soviet military formations from prisoners of war, most notably the Russian Liberation Army under General Andrei Vlasov. The existence of these collaborationist units made Soviet authorities deeply suspicious of all returned prisoners. Bondovsky underwent extensive interrogation. He would have been required to provide detailed accounts of his capture, his time in captivity, his escape attempts, and his journey back to Soviet lines. Every detail would have been scrutinized for inconsistencies. His interrogators would have been looking for any indication that his escapes had been facilitated by the Germans, that he had agreed to serve as an agent, or that he had been compromised in any way. The interrogation process could last weeks or months, and many returned prisoners of war were sent directly to Gulag labor camps, despite having committed no crime beyond the misfortune of capture. Remarkably, Bondovsky was cleared. The fact that he had escaped twice, that he had made contact with partisans, and that he had demonstrated unwavering determination to return to Soviet service apparently convinced the NKVD of his loyalty. This clearance was not universal among returned prisoners. Many officers who had escaped and returned were nonetheless sent to punishment battalions, penal units that were assigned the most dangerous combat missions with minimal equipment and support. These units suffered catastrophic casualties, and assignment to a penal battalion was often effectively a death sentence. That Bondovsky avoided this fate and was instead allowed to return to regular military service speaks to the strength of the case he presented during interrogation. Bondovsky was restored to duty and continued to serve in the Red Army for the remainder of the war. The exact details of his subsequent service are not extensively documented in readily available Western sources, which is common for Soviet officers of his rank. He likely participated in the Great Soviet Offensives of 1943 through 1945, the massive operations that drove German forces back across Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and ultimately into Germany itself. These operations were characterized by enormous casualties on both sides, but they demonstrated the Red Army's evolution into a formidable military force, capable of large-scale combined arms operations and the systematic destruction of German defensive positions. The war ended in May 1945 with the Soviet capture of Berlin. For Bondovsky, survival through the entire war was itself an achievement. The casualty rates among Soviet officers were staggering. The Red Army lost over 8 million dead during the war, with millions more wounded. Officers, particularly those in combat commands, faced disproportionately high casualty rates. That Bondovsky survived not only German captivity and 2 escapes, but also the subsequent years of brutal combat speaks to a combination of skill, courage, and extraordinary luck. After the war, Bondovsky's story took on additional significance. The Soviet state, having initially treated returned prisoners of war with suspicion and cruelty, gradually began to recognize and celebrate certain escape stories as examples of Soviet heroism and resistance. This shift was part of the broader construction of the Great Patriotic War narrative, the official Soviet interpretation of the war that emphasized heroism, sacrifice, and ultimate victory, while downplaying the catastrophic failures of 1941 and the brutal treatment of prisoners and their families. Bondovsky's double escape fit perfectly into this narrative. He became an example of the indomitable Soviet spirit, the refusal to submit to fascist captivity, and the determination to continue fighting regardless of circumstances. Bondovsky was awarded military decorations for his service, though the specific medals and the dates of their award are not consistently documented across sources. He continued in military service after the war, as many career officers did. Though he did not rise to the highest ranks of the Soviet military hierarchy, he eventually retired with the rank of colonel, a respectable achievement, but not the general officer rank that his wartime exploits might have warranted. This relatively modest final rank may reflect the continuing stigma associated with having been captured, despite his escapes and clearance by the NKVD. The Soviet military, even decades after the war, maintained prejudices against those who had experienced captivity. Alexander Bondovsky's story, while remarkable, was not entirely unique. Thousands of Soviet prisoners of war attempted escapes, and hundreds succeeded in reaching Soviet lines or joining partisan units. What distinguishes Bondovsky is the documented fact of two successful escapes, a feat that required not only physical courage and endurance, but also exceptional determination, and perhaps a degree of tactical intelligence that allowed him to learn from his first escape and apply those lessons to his second. Each escape represented a rejection of the fate that Nazi Germany had planned for Soviet prisoners, a personal act of resistance that contributed, in however small a way, to the ultimate Soviet victory. The broader historical context of Soviet prisoners of war remains one of the most tragic aspects of the Second World War. The millions who died in German captivity represent a deliberate policy of extermination through neglect and abuse. Those who survived and returned home often faced decades of suspicion and discrimination, denied the recognition and support afforded to other veterans. It was not until the final years of the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet period that the full extent of their suffering and the injustice of their treatment by their own government began to be openly acknowledged. Bondovsky's story, because it ended in successful escape and return to service, represents one of the more positive outcomes in this generally dark chapter of history. But it cannot erase the suffering of the millions who did not escape, who died in captivity, or who returned home only to face imprisonment in the Gulag. The legacy of Alexander Bondovsky's escapes extends beyond his individual story. It serves as a reminder of the human capacity for resistance even in the most desperate circumstances, the refusal to accept defeat or submission even when survival seems impossible. In the context of the Eastern Front, where the scale of violence and suffering exceeded anything seen in the Western theaters of the war, individual acts of courage and defiance take on particular significance. They represent the human dimension of a conflict often reduced to statistics of armies, casualties, and territorial gains. Behind those statistics were millions of individual stories of courage, suffering, survival, and loss. Today, as the Second World War recedes further into history and the last veterans and survivors pass away, stories like Bondovsky's become increasingly important as historical records and moral lessons. They remind us of the costs of totalitarian ideologies, both Nazi and Soviet, that viewed individual human lives as expendable resources in service of grand historical projects. They illustrate the consequences of military unpreparedness and political miscalculation, as exemplified by the catastrophic Soviet defeats of 1941. And they demonstrate that even within systems designed to crush individual agency and initiative, human beings retain the capacity to choose resistance, to risk everything for freedom, and to refuse the roles that history seems to have assigned them. Alexander Bondovsky escaped from German captivity not once, but twice, defying both Nazi Germany and the statistical probability of survival. His story stands as testament to the enduring power of human will against even the most overwhelming odds.